Crime, punishment, and violence in ancient Egypt. In this viewing experience, I invite you to join us on a journey back to the courtyard of the Hyksos Palace at Avaris Tel El Daba in northeastern Egypt. The palace was constructed during the 15th dynasty, 1640 BC, 1530 BC. Enjoy the video until the end for a special gift. The 12 hands were buried in 3 pits. 12 severed hands have been discovered in Egypt, part of a gruesome trophy-taking practice that has just been revealed in a groundbreaking study. This finding marks the first known physical evidence of hand amputations in ancient Egypt, shedding new light on the dark side of the civilization's history. The Hyksos Palace served as the capital of the Hyksos dynasty during the Second Intermediate Period. Previously, archaeologists have discovered severed hands depicted in Egyptian tomb inscriptions and temple reliefs from the New Kingdom onwards. Out of the 12 hands studied, 6 were found to have intact proximal row carpal bones, which are the group of 8 small bones in the wrist that connect hands to forearms. But because no fragments of lower arm bones were recovered from the pit, the researchers favor the idea that the hands were deliberately amputated, having been sliced through the wrist joint capsule, then cut across the tendons that span the wrist joint. Ceremonial amputations? It was found that the 12 hands were still soft and flexible when they were deposited into the pit. This means the hands were either interred before the onset of rigor mortis or after it had passed. Depending on various factors including temperature and humidity, the deceased individual's age and physical condition, rigor mortis sets within a few hours after death, peaks at around 12 to 24 hours, and most often disappears over the course of 1 to 3 days. However, the scientists concluded that the 12 people were dismembered during or shortly before a ceremony. In the ancient Celtic world, slain warriors were often decapitated during and after battles, and their heads were later mounted on spikes as trophies of war. In this new study, it is believed that the practice of amputating the right hands of enemies, known as trophy-taking, was introduced to Egypt by the Hyksos people around 50 to 80 years before the act was inscribed in Egyptian tombs. Hyksos trophy-taking. The Hyksos originated from Western Asia, and after invading Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, 1650 BC to 1550 BC, they established their base. Based at their capital city of Avaris, in the eastern delta, the Hyksos had developed advanced military tactics, including the use of war chariots and bronze metallurgy. The paper says depictions from this time found at the temple of Seti Wust in Abydos, west of the Nile River in Upper Egypt, show a stack of hands. In the case of these 12 severed hands, the study says they were probably presented as prizes during a public event held at the palace. Murder and violent crimes in ancient Egypt. From 3 letters of the late Ramesside era, we recover hints of a plot to kill 2 Medjay apparently in order to keep them from testifying in some manner against the perpetrators. The secrecy of the plot makes it clear that this act would be looked upon most unfavorably, even though people of power were involved. Record S of legal proceedings also hint at violence, such as the acts attempted in connection with the harem conspiracy in the reign of Ramesses. These records may give us a clue as to what Weni, an Old Kingdom official, meant when he enigmatically spoke of hearing a secret matter in the harem, but we cannot know. Similarly, the Persian period petition of Petiez outlines a case of murder, giving us a small insight into violent events that must have happened throughout Egyptian history. One of the most profitable sources for learning about cruelty are oracular texts. For example, we can read of death being decreed by oracle for embezzlers. When trials were decided by appeals to oracles, often the deeds of the accused were either written on a text presented to the oracle, or the oracle's decision was written down. From these kinds of texts, we learn of 2 boys who were beaten to death and of the execution of their murderers. In another, we learn of 2 men who had been caught in illegal acts trying to murder the man who had discovered them before he could tell anyone. While the official writings of Egypt do not present us with the illicit violence that could be a part of lived experience, such acts become more apparent in their laundry lists. Clearly, murder, or killing someone who was innocent, was viewed as wrong. Pienki forbade certain men from entering a temple because they did a thing which God did not command should be done. They conceived evil in their hearts, even slaying one who was without guilt. While it is clear that such killing was outside of what the divine and mortal realm sanctioned, it is curious that the punishment, apparently for attempted or at least plotted murder, appears to be so mild. Crimes worthy of execution in ancient Egypt. Similarly, one would assume that execution for murder would have been invariable, but we only have evidence for murder from the Third Intermediate period forward. Desecration of royal tombs was viewed as a capital offense. Also, death was sometimes the punishment decreed for interference with mortuary cults, rendering false rulings, rendering false oracles, non-royal tomb desecration, interfering with temple cults, embezzling cultic proceeds, diverting corvée labor, issuing false documents, or stealing state property. In some decrees, these acts are deemed worthy of death, and in others they are given lighter, though still violent and harsh, punishments. For example, in Seti's Nauri decree, he stipulates various beatings, wounding, and restitutions for embezzling and reselling temple estate goods. Yet, if these crimes were committed by a keeper of hounds or keeper of cattle, they were to be impaled. The inconsistency of punishments in the decree is hard to explain. The most famous cases of sanctioned violence stem from the texts recording the trial of harem conspirators under Ramesses III and those recording the trials of those involved in tomb robbery in the late 20th dynasty. In both cases, those directly responsible for the crimes met death. In the harem conspiracy, almost all those who were merely aware of the conspiracy were put to death or were allowed to commit suicide. Despite the arguments of many scholars, there is no apparent pattern to explain why some individuals were put to death while others were permitted to take their own life. Numerous texts indicate that capital punishment for unspecified criminal activity was an ongoing practice that continued throughout Egyptian history. Attestations of this are Faux and in graffiti, which speak of desecrators' flesh burning together with the criminals or being cooked with the criminals. A coffin text descendant of the spell from the pyramid texts, often termed the Cannibal Hymn, also mentions burning criminals. We cannot determine if the crimes referred to in this type of reference are those noted above, or if they refer to a specific type of crime in addition to those listed above that was deemed worthy of death. Some have argued that killing was sanctioned in the case of a cuckolded husband in regards to the man with whom his wife had slept. The arguments for this are speculative and the evidence is inconclusive. Women and crime in ancient Egypt. These ordinary and extraordinary roles are not the only ones in which we see Egyptian women cast in ancient Egypt. We also see Egyptian women as the victims of crime and rape, also as the perpetrators of crime, as adulteresses and even as convicts. Women criminals certainly existed, although they do not appear frequently in the historical record. A woman named Nesmut was implicated in a series of robberies of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the 20th dynasty. Examples of women convicts are also known. According to one Brooklyn Museum papyrus from the Middle Kingdom, a woman was incarcerated at the prison at Thebes because she fled her district to dodge the corvée service on a royal estate. Most of the concubines and lesser wives involved in the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III were convicted and had their noses and ears cut off, while others were invited to commit suicide. Another woman is indicated among the lists of prisoners from a prison at El Lahoun. However, of the prison lists we have, the percentage of women's names is very small compared to those of men, and this fact may be significant. Violence in ancient Egypt. Sanctioned violence could be employed for a variety of reasons, the severity of which ranged from inflicting blows to gruesome death. Violence was part of the preternatural realm, notably as Egyptians attempted to thwart potential violence in the afterlife. While the average Egyptian was supposed to avoid hostility, kings and their representatives were expected to engage in violent acts in many circumstances. Improper conflict disturbed order while sanctioned violence restored it. While the types of sanctioned violence employed and the reasons for employing it changed over time, some attitudes about savagery remained constant, more so about later periods rather than earlier. We must use caution when retrojecting later views about violence to earlier periods, though often all we have is later evidence. These considerations notwithstanding, when we examine all the data available, we can accumulate a fair view of Egypt's attitude towards and experience of violence. The earliest religious texts are replete with references to preternatural violence, a practice which remains consistent throughout Egyptian civilization. The pyramid texts contain numerous references to the violence of gods, many of which pertain to incidents for which we have later narratives. Even among the gods, we are presented with a bifurcated view of violence. According to many texts, the first act to disturb order was an act of violence, whether it be the slaying and mutilation of Osiris or some kind of rebellion among mankind and a consequent violent response from a deity. These unsanctioned acts of violence were abhorrent, yet they were set aright by a violent response. In the case of Osiris's slaying, Order was eventually restored after Horus defeats Seth in a violent battle that, in some versions, included spearing, decapitation, gouging eyes out, rape, and threats of killing other gods. Mankind was punished for its rebellion by near destruction, the myth of the heavenly cow. The instructions for Merakara tell us the Creator slew his own children when they contemplated rebelling against him. This battle often becomes personified, such as the ongoing battle between Apophis and the sun god, or as in accounts of Seth stabbing and spearing the chaos serpent. However brutal reality was, it pales in comparison to the violence potentially experienced as part of the afterlife. From the earliest funerary literature to the latest, the afterlife was depicted as a place fraught with bloodshed. Thus, the texts appropriately contained instructions and spells aimed at avoiding it. There are repeated references to divine slaughterhouses and to gods slaughtering men. A frequent theme is wishing to avoid those who beat with sticks or who cut off heads, stab, entrap, or mutilate. Frequently in the afterlife, gates present fearsome guardians with knives who await those who are unprepared. Our greatest barrier to understanding violence in ancient Egypt is the reticence which sources express towards the recording of illicit acts of brutality. This, in and of itself, indicates something of attitudes towards cruelty. In general, while we know violence existed, private actions were supposed to avoid drama. Undoubtedly, however, sanctioned violence, or bloodshed deemed as appropriate, permeated most aspects of Egyptian society. Beatings and mutilations, sanctioned violence in ancient Egypt. Old Kingdom tomb scenes frequently show people being beaten, sometimes with sticks that are shaped to look like a man's hand, often while tied to a post. According to tomb captions and the Satire of Trades, one of the more frequent reasons for beatings was a failure to pay taxes. Beatings and inflicting open wounds were among the most common forms of punishment and could be inflicted for crimes such as failure to pay a debt, theft, improper appropriation of state workers, bringing charges against a superior, spreading rumors, not prosecuting crimes, unauthorized contact with sacred elements, interference with fishing and fowling, false legal action, libel or inappropriate entrance of a tomb. The most common beatings consisted of either 100 or 200 blows, and in more severe punishments were commonly accompanied by 5 open wounds. Schoolboys could also be beaten for faulty scribal work. Beatings were also used during interrogations. Such a beating, if it produced a confession, could be followed by more beatings or worse punishments. Mutilation was another common form of violent punishment, most frequently manifested in cutting off the nose or ears. This could happen for various crimes, including encroachment on foundation fields, agricultural property dedicated to supporting cultic or royal undertakings, interfering with offerings, select thefts, and even for involvement in the harem conspiracy recorded in the reign of Ramesses III. Executions in ancient Egypt. The reasons for and types of execution varied over time, but sanctioned violent death remained an invariable part of Egyptian society. Death by burning was a consistent type of violence employed throughout Egyptian history, though the evidence for it increased sharply after the end of the Ramesside period. Decapitation was one of the more frequent tools of death early in Egyptian history, but appears to have declined from the Ramesside era on. Slaying in a ritual context, that sanctioned killing that involved demonstrable ritual trappings, was consistently employed over time. Drowning was also sometimes employed. Impalement was infrequently used except during the Ramesside era, when it seems to have been the preferred form of punishment, ritual and royal violence in ancient Egypt. Most of this violence, however, was enacted against animals or inanimate objects. Early dynastic labels appear to depict violent rituals, such as a jur label illustrating some kind of royal festival, part of which depicts a bound man seemingly being stabbed by a priest. Violent imagery in ancient Egypt, piles of hands, arms, and penises. Clearly, even real forms of violence also carried symbolism. But in this case, the question is whether smiting scenes were ever carried out on real humans. While we cannot know how accurate the portrayals are, the images present an iconography of domination, subjugation, and humiliation. If there is some degree of accuracy in depictions of how prisoners were bound, then often the binding was done in a way which would have caused severe and painful damage to muscles and joints. Depictions frequently portrayed positions possibly leading to asphyxiation. Elbows, knees, necks, and ankles particularly were portrayed in awkward and painful positions. Frequently, the violence portrayed was compounded by violence done to the image. Some images were broken, mutilated, or decapitated. Another class of bound prisoner images was continually placed, where they would be walked on. such as tiles of a palace floor, the sill of the window of appearance, on sandals or on footstools. An early dynastic tomb has a bound prisoner as the pivot point for a door, so that each time the door moved it ground on the prisoner's back. Tutankhamun's bow was decorated with prisoners whose necks were bound by the bowstring, thus further strangling them with each arrow shot. Enemy heads form the oar stops on a bark of a moon, causing the enemies to be struck with each stroke. The taking of a hand or an arm is often attested as a battle trophy. Depictions show piles of hands, arms, or penises as a part of battle aftermath. Amenhotep II slew a number of prisoners, hung their bodies from the bow of his boat. It is not clear if the killing was before or after the hanging, and then displayed them in Egypt and Nubia. Justification of violence in ancient Egypt. Most hostility we know of is royal violence. Kings both decried violence among others and extolled their own aggression exercises. For example, Sinuhe describes Senusret I as a lord of kindness, great of sweetness. He conquered through love. Yet, lines later, Senusret is reported to be a vengeful smasher of foreheads, one who subjugates countries, slaying with only one blow, and one who will strike Asiatics and trample sand dwellers. Non-sanctioned violence, despite the ideology of avoiding aggression outside sanctioned domains. Undoubtedly, Egypt had its share of violent citizens. Letters in Ostraca are one source for learning about such hostility. From these, we know that some in Deir el-Medina beat their inferiors, and even that one man was beaten for reporting that a superior had slept with his wife. If this video added any value to your understanding of Egypt's ancient past, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the Mythic Time Machine. Thanks for watching until the end. For great gifts and gadgets, visit megdigital.com and use code TREASURE and get 20% off.
Arg. 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 Do it smartly. Do it smartly. Do it smartly.